Well, from the CivicCon, this is Quint Studer. I'm thrilled you're all here. Some of you on my shirt says local. So what I'm trying to do is shop local. People ask me from other cities, I've been doing a lot of webinars, what can we do to be helpful? And I say, shop local. Even if the store's not open, get a certificate for when it does open, because that's the number one issue right now. Many times is small businesses, will they come back and so on. So welcome everyone to CivicCon. It's an exciting time to have Victor Dover here. This was like a 1-2 punch. Last night I got to watch The Last Dance with Michael Jordan. And then here today I get to look at the Michael Jordan of urban planning and Victor Dover. So thank you very much. To our CivicCon members, we're up to 100 people now that have joined CivicCon. If you're interested in joining CivicCon, just drop us a note. Terry Harn will help you join it. And that sort of makes us more financially sustainable, because for the last 2.5 years, it's pretty much been supported by 1 or 2 individuals, and this makes sure that it can continue. We also utilize our CivicCon members. We recently had a meeting, and we're looking at all the video. We have the videos of who's who's. If you're interested in private-public partnership, you can go to Tom Murphy. If you're looking at character counts, character looks, you can go to Ed McMahon. If you're talking about parking, you can go to Donald Shoup. If you're talking about resiliency and waterfront, you can go to Gina Wirth. So we have these great speakers, and CivicCon members are helping us pull these together so we can give them to you in an easier, user-friendly way to make it happen. This is a great time for Pensacola. The virus is terrible, but it's a great time for the fact that we can come out of this better than we ever were. But again, not discounting the tragedy that has happened. But when you think about what we've got on the to-do list, we've got the hashtag, we've got Scape, which it was really neat this weekend to drive by and see cars parked, walking around Bruce Beach and so on. West Main, for those of you 250 people are involved in the West Main plan, that's gone out to 23 different companies with an RFP, and many of them are already responding with their plans. So that's exciting. Some things that have already taken place. Spring Street. Now, one thing I've learned about any city is not everyone will be happy. In fact, I tell communities, if you can get 65% of the people happy, you've probably got a happy place, because it just won't work for everyone. And I know some people wanted more bike lanes, but the fact that very quickly Mayor Robinson and the city council took our speed limits down. Remember, if you get hit, we learned this from Chuck Marone, if you get hit at 45 miles per hour, you're probably going to 8 out of 10 will die. If you get hit at 35, 4 out of 10 will die. And if you get hit at 25, you're probably going to live. So reducing speed limit is not about reducing speed limit, it's about saving lives. It also responded to parking. For $25,000, we gained an awful lot of angled parking spots. So that's pretty cool. So that's really coming up. So we're excited about that, and the DeVillers project. As you know, the topic is affordable housing. For those of you like Buzz Ritchie that are anxious to hear about it, Buzz, be patient. We'll get to you just in a few minutes. Civic IQ, when we're talking in Baton Rouge about the Civic IQ, I was talking about what we're doing in Pensacola, bringing in all these speakers, and somebody said, you're raising the Civic IQ, and that's really what this is all about. Now, one of the things we know is this is an unusual crisis, and it's happening everywhere. It's not like a place that's just happening in one community or one region. So it's going to count on who comes out of this the best. And we have some things that are happening that can really play in Pensacola's favor. Number one is so many people are now working virtually. In fact, we have people that live in San Francisco that are flying here, want to meet with us Friday about moving parts of their business here, because they've decided that they'd rather be in a smaller community like Pensacola than a bigger urban environment. We have people that have come home right down the street. We've got a young lady who works in Washington, D.C. She came to be with mom in the quarantine. Maybe she can prove that I can work virtually. And so I think that's really neat what we're doing. When we've looked at these speakers, I can see why this is such a tough topic. It's very easy for people to say we need more affordable housing. Well, then write a big check to help people get in. So unless you have a lot of money willing to write a check, it's easy to tell somebody else to do it, but it's pretty dang hard. I'm glad this is our speaker in our third year, because I think in our first year it would have been overwhelming. Our first year we talked about sidewalks and creating bike paths. better lighting, all important things, more shade. But this affordable housing is really, really difficult because the definition of what is affordable, what's affordable for somebody. We are lucky in our community, and our median income has now gone up to $52,000 a median income, which is the highest it's ever been. We're actually now higher than the state average. So maybe there's more affordable if you're making, of course, more money. Then people want to say, well, just build a whole bunch of little houses. Well, that might be good for some people, but maybe not some for families. How do you finance it? And Victor Dover is going to talk about that. I'll give you some statistics. We're building a 24 apartment building at Belmont and De Villers. It's $7.2 million. We put down $3 million and only borrowed $4.2 million, which is a heck of a down payment. Our rents are based on a 4% return on investment. Yet I will tell you, for some people, those rents will not be affordable. And I bring that up just to give you a real life picture of how hard it is. Now, or if somebody says, well, let the government give them some incentives to do affordable housing, then somebody's yelling about, well, why are they getting incentives? So this is a tough subject. So to handle this tough subject, we're brought in a national expert on this. Victor Dover, he's a principal in charge of Victor Dover Company, basically. He's nationally recognized an innovator in city planning, neighborhood design, and street design. He has led more than 200 charrettes. Victor lectures widely around the world on topics of livable communities and sustainable development. He has served as a national chair of Congress for the New Urbanism. He co-authored with John Massengale a breakthrough book, Street Design, The Secret to Great Cities and Towns, published by Wiley in 2014. He's been awarded the John Nolan Medal for contributions for urbanism. He's a fellow of both the American Institute of Certified Planners and CNU. He's an adjunct faculty member at the University of Miami. He also serves as vice president for Parks Foundation for Miami. So we're really lucky to have Victor. And Mayor Robinson has talked to Victor last week, and there's a follow-up meeting with a number of elected officials coming up in, I think, next week or the week after. Victor's put a lot of time and effort into Pensacola, Florida. So I know you are all virtual, but if you would, put your hands together. Let's give a nice round of applause for Victor Dover.
All right. Well, thank you very much for that, Quint. I really appreciate the chance to talk about this. You know, at the very start of the lecture here, I'm going to ask you a question. I'll just tell you what it is. I'm going to ask you if you've ever noticed whether some places feel like someplace and others just feel like no place, and ask, why is that? What's the difference? In a way, it's about the ultimate test of a human habitat. You know, have you or have you not created a place where people want to be? And of course, when you create one that succeeds, and succeeds for hundreds of years, it's going to build a momentum. And that means you have to eventually deal with the problem that comes from it being so popular that it's difficult to offer it up to enough people at a price that everyone you want to be able to afford it can afford it. So this is a technical topic. We get into affordable housing. We are under the hood working on the mechanics. But just at a high level, I want to tell you thanks for inviting me. I've learned so much from my conversations with Mayor Robinson and Terry Horn and others over the last few days, from a little bit of research I was able to do about your town. You know, I'm mightily impressed also with everything that you're already doing to build civic IQ, as you said, to plan for the future of your waterfront, a one-of-a-kind public asset, the generosity of public space that you envision providing, not just for the next decade or for the next few generations, but for forever. That is a really amazing accomplishment. And so the fact that you're getting out ahead of this question on affordable housing and you're asking the hard questions is really, really encouraging. I have an old friend named Dan Carey who once said that no community worthy of the name should ever deliberately set out to create a plan for less than what it considers ideal. Think about that for a minute. Of course, we aim really high and we imagine a plan that has something for everybody. It has affordability where you need it. It has mobility where you need it. It's inspiring and beautiful and artful, which we all need. It's environmentally sound and it's set up to succeed even against challenges like sea level rise or pandemic or what have you. Well, to get that to happen, you have to aim really high. Imagine what you consider to be ideal. You will always fall a little short of that. but if you do, you'll earn the term, the worthy of the name community. So at the end of the tape, which they're going to roll momentarily, I can come back in and we'll do some live Q&A, and I look forward to your questions. Have you ever wondered why some places feel like someplace and other places feel like no place? And have you ever wondered why, with all this growth and development and change, we still have so much lost space in our towns, and yet we have a problem having enough affordable housing, having affordable lifestyles, having good transportation? If you've wondered about those things, I'm going to help you connect the dots. I'm going to talk about housing, but I'm going to talk about it while we think about transportation, your environment, the economy, and connect the dots. Now, I'm going to speak during this presentation about housing and transportation in particular, and I'm going to talk about what you can do, whether you're an employer or an elected official or an agency staffer or an ordinary citizen or a developer, to make the world better every time you put one brick on top of another and help build the transportation system or add to housing. In particular, when we design neighborhoods, we have to think about housing, transportation, and commerce, and the environment simultaneously. My name is Victor Dover. I'm a town planner and urban designer. In our practice, Dover Cole & Partners, we design neighborhoods. And this is an example of one of them, Glenwood Park in Atlanta. And in this picture, you can actually see places where people buy pizza and where they work out, and places where they work, and places where they live, all in the same scene. And Glenwood Park is one of those neighborhoods where you can walk from one thing to another without having to get in your car to do it. Those buildings in the background on this picture are live-work units. They actually are designed to allow for someone to pay just one rent or one mortgage for both their workplace and their home. In the work we do in designing new neighborhoods, a lot of time it's about adding to what's missing. So adding what's missing to what's already there. So, for example, adding the hotel to go with the houses, or adding the new street scene to go with the old ones. And of course, a lot of it is about the design of a place that people will find attractive and magnetic, so they will choose it over other environments, the key to making real estate successful. But in most of our work, we go back and look at the skipped over real estate, where there's lost space, and people are trying to figure out how to make a nicer place out of the one they've already got, that maybe was developed originally as, say, buildings poking out of parking lots, but could be a new center for their neighborhood. Now, I'm going to show one project here at the beginning so you get an idea what I mean about designing the neighborhood, not just the buildings. This is the South Side in Chattanooga, Tennessee. This neighborhood was hit with hard times, and a pretty hard scrabble neighborhood. And what you see here is the way it looked in the late 1990s when we first started looking at it. A lot of people had fled the neighborhood, and a lot of industry had fled the neighborhood. On the other hand, it was just steps away from lots of jobs. 4,000 people working at the Tennessee Valley Authority headquarters, just a stone's throw away, and lots of other employers close by. So we thought, if we can build back up the South Side neighborhood, we can take those long car trips people in Chattanooga are making and allow them to have a short commute and a close-in, more livable and more beautiful neighborhood. Now, when we started, we found that the South Side needed a lot of help. This is their Main Street, for example. The Main Street was 90% vacant at the time when we took this photograph. And the buildings were all boarded up, and there's just nothing happening on Main Street. So we devised a plan for street-oriented architecture and for building up street scenes one at a time that would restore confidence in the neighborhood. So you can see that when you look at historical aerial photographs now from the late 90s versus more recent photographs that show all the infill development and change. Now, they set out to create mixed income housing, and one of the first things they did was build streets. And you might think, well, wait a minute, that sounds like a transportation project. But in fact, what they were doing was setting up addresses that would give people choices. So they made real street-like streets,
the street trees and on-street parking. And then they began to connect those streets and build along those streets. They added incrementally a lot of naturally occurring traditional housing. Houses, duplexes, triplexes, row houses, small apartment buildings, park spaces. This caught everyone's attention, and then the artists came and galleries opened, and the South Side became a place to go just to look around or to have a meal. The historic buildings found new tenants, and they were restored, and the lights were turned back on. And now Main Street looks like this. Here's one of the before pictures from not that long ago, and that building is now one of Chattanooga's best restaurants. Before and after thinking. Before and after thinking continues to this day in the South Side, because things we couldn't have imagined a couple of decades ago are now happening all the time. Infill development, new hotels, more workplaces, more housing. So that's a model that needs to be replicated in many communities around the country. And they're working on it now in downtown Atlanta. This is the South Downtown area. And the priority there now is to bring the lights back on in their historical buildings, fill in the lost space on vacant lots and underutilized properties in and around those historic buildings, and create what they now call the South Downtown Pedestrian Priority Zone. The planning director said, how about instead of treating downtown streets like glorified on-ramps to Atlanta's interstate system, we actually make them great addresses where people want to be. And the secret to the South Side plan in Chattanooga is playing out here in South Downtown Atlanta. Now, what I've been describing through these examples is a natural process of human town crafting. We build our habitat, and sometimes we build rural villages, sometimes we build suburbs or small towns, or the metropolitan centers of big cities. But they're all really the interconnected human habitat. There's a friend of mine named Ed Glazer. He's a Harvard economist, and he wrote this book called The Triumph of the City. And he makes an audacious claim. He says, the city is humankind's greatest invention. And I think he's right, because the city does more than the utilitarian, mechanical problem solving we think of immediately, like putting shelter over our heads or allowing us to have streets to go from one place to another. The city is actually a concentrator and communicator of ideas. It's a magnet for talent. It's a place where people exchange socially and commercially. Now, meanwhile, when those cities get really popular, a problem inevitably shows up as wages rise, but not nearly as fast as the cost of housing. A gap is created over time, and with the passage of time and increasing costs of constructing and delivering housing, particularly if it's in short supply and the law of supply and demand is working against you because scarcity makes prices go up. If wages are relatively flat, there will be a gap. And this is a problem we need to work on with both the employer and the wage growth and the housing, by making sure we're not unduly crimping the supply and that we're being creative about organically grown forms of affordable housing. Now, in Florida, we have a particular problem where we're building hundreds of thousands of units, but most of them are built for people who can afford to pay more. And so we still have a huge gap. We actually decreased the number of units in the last couple decades for people who are paying a modest price per month for rental apartments, for example. So even with all those additional apartments, we still have a problem. Meanwhile, we do need to keep adding, because historically, new housing is almost always built for people who have a choice about where they're going to go and who have the ability to pay a little bit more. And so we need a lot of housing, including a lot of used and older housing, to make sure that we have a supply plentiful for people who are paying at a more modest price point. Now, when I look at Escambia County in particular and compare it to the other counties, I can see that the problem is actually huge. The number of people, whether they're in the 30 to 60% of average median income, or 60 to 80, or 80 to 120, there are vast numbers of people in Escambia County and in Pensacola in particular who need this housing. So we've got to figure out ways to get creative. Now, there's a term we use in describing housing in planning circles. It's called the cost burden. Cost-burdened households are those who are finding they have to spend more than 40% of their monthly income on the cost of their shelter. That's a number that is too high to sustain because of all their other costs like food and transportation, clothing, and college and tuition and things like that. So we have to figure out a way to get more housing available to people at a smaller percentage of their household income. But we don't need more cheap, mean-spirited housing. Need for affordable housing to occur for sure, but we don't need for it to be ugly or undesirable just to keep the price down. So what can we do? Well, each dwelling unit that is produced comes with costs. And those costs include the costs of bricks and mortar, sticks and bricks to construct it. They include the soft costs like hiring architects and engineers and paying for permits and marketing and managing the units. And they have the cost of the land underneath them. And if you only have a few units on a rectangle of land, you're going to have to divide the cost of that land, the purchase price of that land, by the number of units you can fit. And if you can only fit a few, more of that cost is going to go to each unit. So to start with, we can build things on narrower lots. These are single family houses, but they are attached to each other on narrow lots like traditional row houses. In this case, fairly spectacularly modern, beautifully proportioned, but simple to build, rectangular foundations, and attached to each other. So these are row houses that have a lot of dignity, but they have a lower per unit land cost than if there was a yard around each house. Another thing we can do is look for places to infill small apartment buildings in and among the houses and duplexes of the neighborhood. It doesn't take very many of these to add greatly to the number of housing units that are available. But architecture matters, and design and site planning matters. That building to street relationship has to be right. Small traditional apartment buildings like this one in the Connecticut Avenue Northwest part of Washington, D.C. are generally acceptable to the people who live in the nearby houses and row houses because they're architecturally charming. In zoning, we often find that the instinct has been to regulate stuff so that it's pushed farther apart, to try and have less impact, one thing upon another, to move the houses farther from the places of worship or other civic uses, or farther from the workplaces and farther from the place to buy a pizza. So the result of that, of course, is a higher per unit land cost and longer car trips because now things are so far apart. You have to drive to get from your house to everything else. On the other hand, traditional towns have always been about bringing things closer together to actually put more things within walking distance of your front porch, and in the process, to lower the per unit land cost. I'm discussing the difference between suburban sprawl, like most of Florida has been disfigured with, and traditional towns. If we push things farther apart, we're going to raise the prices. If we bring things closer together, we're going to lower the costs, but we're also going to lower the impact on our environment. We're going to need less land in order to accommodate our growing population, and we're going to lower the cost of delivering municipal services. Now, you might think, since I'm talking about lowering the per unit land cost, that I'll be out there to advocate for the tallest possible building, and that's not the case. For example, just look at this chart for a second. All construction is expensive in the Sunshine State, but as we switch from the low-rise construction methods to mid-rise and to high-rise, the cost of construction rises dramatically in each case. And those costs have to be passed along as well. So if you're going to build a high-rise building to try and densify your way out of the cost problem, remember that the extra cost of construction is going to be offsetting that lower per unit land cost, and you're probably producing luxury units in the sky. So, what can we do about that? Well, one of the things we can do is find lost space, land that's been skipped over for one reason or another, or is already available to government or nonprofits, and use that space to build without that exorbitant per unit land cost. I'll give you an example. Here's a street in Arlington, Virginia. Now, that building, that little one-story building that's adjacent to the road corridor going by, is a real underutilization of the land. And if we didn't have to have that big surface parking lot and we could do more with that land, we would find one of those places to build, one you didn't even think of as a potential housing location. And you could do a little more or do a little less, but the point is that was skipped over real estate that could be found and put into service and help with the supply. In Oakland, California, they've gone from 50 years of decline and neglect to a rapid increase in interest in development downtown. And a lot of development can be accommodated in the downtown of Oakland near their public transit system and so on, without going out into the Central Valley of California to try and find some place to build. But if you just look on the upper left-hand side of the screen, you'll see the area of the I-980 corridor. What if that space wasn't needed for a big oversized highway, but could be used as a development site, and in the process produce a lot of newfound land for new housing? Here's the 980 corridor. It's like a trench that divides downtown Oakland from West Oakland. Turns out it's not that important from a transportation point of view to have a highway there. And if that space could be recaptured and the superhighway could be replaced with a at-grade surface boulevard, kind of a traditional street type, like a linear park, it would free up the rest of the land at land that the taxpayers already own free and clear to be used for public purposes, including making it available as low-cost land for infill housing. And the street itself can be a great address and asset to the city instead of a trench dividing two neighborhoods. So everywhere you look, there's some of this lost space. What about the strip shopping centers and dead shopping malls? They have big parking lots they don't need anymore, and those sites can be turned into mixed income, mixed use places that aren't just more buildings where the parking lots used to be, but actually the combination of uses that allows people to shorten their car trips, use transit, and be less dependent on fossil fuels. And that can be a change over time scenario that begins slowly and is added to step by step. Now, where else can you find lost space? Even those tiny little parking lots that seem to be everywhere can be used as places for housing. So this is some of the most clever housing. This is in Winter Park, Florida. And you're looking at this charming vine-covered village-scale architecture. There are small dwelling units in the upper floors of these buildings. Well, you can't tell from the street, but you can tell if you look at it from overhead, is that that's actually a liner around the edge of the block, up above the parking spaces, that covers them up from view and screens them so we don't have the ugly parking lot to look at from the street, but also produces right above the parking spaces on the edge some housing to live with dignity in a great neighborhood. Now, I keep talking about the dignity of great neighborhoods. Well, when we go look at traditional American cities, we see things like this, a photograph I made in Buffalo, New York. Now, on this street right here, on this little bend in the road in the neighborhood, you can see a one-story house that's small cottage on the far left side that is got a low floor so seniors can easily get in and out without having to go up ramps and so on. In the middle of the picture, you see a single family house, quite a nice one with a nice porch on the front of it. And on the right side of the picture, you see a much bigger, grander house. And those are all right next to each other on the street. They haven't hurt one another at all by mixing the prices and the sizes and the types of housing right on the same block. And so when we design neighborhoods, we just build that idea in. We design smaller houses like the one here in the foreground right next to the bigger houses down the block. So what else can you do? Well, to lower the per unit land cost, you can take that street frontage and divide it into more lots that are narrow. And of course, Americans have been doing this traditionally for a long time. Think of Rainbow Row in Charleston or the Painted Ladies in San Francisco. Those are narrow lot houses face the street. There's no question about where the front is. And on the lower right-hand side here, you can see the Wheeler District in Oklahoma City, where they're using the narrow lot concept to great effect. On the left side of this picture, those are 16-foot wide row houses in Glenwood Park. And on the right side, again, the Wheeler District in Oklahoma City, live-work units. And then one of my favorites, you can also build small outbuildings or units within the unit that share the lot with a standard single-family house, so-called accessory dwelling units. They used to be called granny flats or in-laws quarters, but the basic idea is that an accessory dwelling unit is made available. It has a relatively small footprint, and it's right on the lot of the principal householder, and it's usually in the back or over a garage or that sort of thing, or in an outbuilding. This is a way of building in low-cost housing because even if it's architecturally spectacular, it has a small square footage. And so instead of being at the lowest possible price per square foot, there are fewer square feet and a unit is made available. Now, several of these are in Coral Gables. They're close to the University of Miami. So think of that young cello teacher or that young pharmacy student that can afford to live in housing of this sort. Now, the best strategy of all is to build slowly. Now, wait, I said we need a bigger supply and we need to build a lot of housing. But actually, if we build a lot of housing in small increments, if we can have a lot of investors, for example, get into the game of development instead of just a few who are doing vast numbers of units, if we could incrementally grow, we can build our way out of our problems. This is often referred to as missing middle housing. In Florida and in much of America, we tend to see single-family detached houses and big condominium complexes and apartment complexes, and very little of the old traditional types that are in between. My friend Dan Perolik from Opticos came up with this term, the missing middle. It includes the duplexes and triplexes, the small cottages, the bungalow courts, the small apartment buildings and row houses that used to be part of the menu for housing in North America. And where can we do it? Well, for one thing, we have way too much retail property. Your old dead Kmart or your old dead Sears and its big old dead Kmart parking lot probably is a good candidate for rethinking, for redividing into blocks and lots so that it can be built out incrementally and include some commerce to replace the commerce that was lost, perhaps not as much, and a lot of the land could be reclaimed to build housing that we need, but with the kind of architectural scale and grace that the neighbors will find acceptable. And best of all, a lot of small bets are possible instead of just one big one all at once. So here's another view of this. And what you see in this image are, on the left side of the screen, some small Main Street type buildings that can have a restaurant or pizza joint, and upstairs some office space. In the foreground, you see some attached houses or a small apartment building or assisted living center. And in the background of the picture, single family detached homes, and triplexes and duplexes and cottages. That's a strategy for incrementally building the town you want. And if it sounds more like the traditional part of your town, the historic center of your town, it is, because that incremental tradition of building is the way most American towns and cities were originally built. In fact, there's a group, they call themselves the Incremental Development Alliance, or INCDEV for short, that's out there teaching people how to do this. And they basically recommend that if you, as a small neighborhood builder and developer, will pick a neighborhood you really love and devote yourself to it for the rest of your career, you can build a few small things at a time. The way Bernice Radel, who's seen here on the right side of the picture, has been building back the Buffalo she loves. Her company is called Buffalove. How perfect is that? Now it's time to see what happens when we put our thoughts about housing together with thoughts about lowering the cost of transportation. The Center for Neighborhood Technology in Chicago calls this the H&T index, housing and transportation costs as a composite number. First, let's look at transportation cost. This is a map of transportation costs in the District of Columbia and its surroundings in 2000. And here's the map of that same place in 2008. And what you're seeing is, because the cost of transportation rose so dramatically during that time, as oil prices rose during that time. The people who had farther to drive to get to their work found their costs dramatically increasing. And of course, the price of oil goes up and down, as you know, all the time. And right now we're at historic lows. And we will again be, in probably no time, flat, again at historic highs. So all it takes is one good Arab oil shock or a hurricane in Houston to generate great fluctuations in the price of oil. And so the cost of transportation tends to fluctuate wildly in just that way. When we put housing and transportation costs together, that's a heavy load to bear. And so for a long time now, this is a document from the early 2000s, people have been realizing that if we're going to deal with the costs of affordable lives, we can't just deal with the housing cost. We have to deal with the transportation cost too. Well, this is a pretty dramatic chart. It shows that if you live in a location efficient spot, like maybe where you can do some things by walking or making short trips or by biking or by using transit, chances are a relatively small percentage of your household income is going to be spent on transportation. But if you live out in the burbs, a lot more is going to be spent. It's logical, you're driving a lot more miles. So that means we have to think about how to make places that actually support walking, biking, and transit. Now, I could just put this pair of pictures up and ask, where would you prefer to live? But actually, I'm thinking, I'll just ask you, which one do you think is more likely to support the ridership needed for successful public transit? We have to build things closer together. We took a hard look at El Paso not too long ago, and we realized there were two dramatic symptoms. One is that growth out on the edge was making life less affordable for people who had to drive a lot. And the hollowing out of the center was leaving them with empty buildings in their downtown. The way that looked on a map is like this, and it's directly related to the cost of their gas. Here again, 2000 versus 2008. And you can see what's happening is that the people that live further out were suddenly burdened anew by the cost of transportation. So here are monthly transportation expenses in Greater El Paso. What do you do about this? Well, first of all, you don't think of it as just a housing or a gas price problem. You realize that all of that driving is also harming the citizens' health. El Paso, with being a place that's hard to walk, that's set up around driving, also ranks among the worst for comorbidities like early onset diabetes and heart disease. So the solutions that will help us with housing and transportation costs also do other good things, like help us improve public health. The plan for El Paso is all about bringing transit where it's needed so people can be among those households near it. Now, when I look at Escambia County and at Pensacola in particular, I see exactly the same thing. The farther out you are, the more you're spending on your transportation, and as a result, the more you're spending on the composite of housing and transportation together. If we know that housing costs are on the rise, we need to do things to keep the transportation cost in check in order to make that monthly income available to deal with the cost of housing. You have to work on the whole problem, not just the housing alone, but the housing and the transportation. When you see them combined here, the cost of housing plus the cost of transport in Pensacola brings it to a number that's comparable with that of Miami. And to deal with that, we have to address both ends of the problem. What can you take away from this? Well, according to this Florida Housing Choice map, the takeaway is there just aren't enough places in Pensacola that are actually close to where you need to go so you can get there by walking, biking, or transit. Now, what could you improve if you fix that? Not just public health, not just the costs. You can improve on the performance of your city when it comes to air quality and to your carbon footprint. If you're concerned about the carbon crisis and the rising temperature of the seas, the carbon dioxide your tailpipe is producing is a lot worse. On the left, you see kind of the old view that cities, because we were denser, consumed a lot more energy and therefore had a bigger carbon footprint than the low density or rural surroundings. As it turns out, those more densely connected cities actually have a much lower per capita cost of energy and resulting emissions. And out on the edge is where the real damage is being done. So, if you can drive a little less because you're living closer together, then you can cause your carbon dioxide footprint to go down. But guess what? This is interesting. If you make the street networks more densely packed, you can have the same effect. And that's also beneficial. And if you can put destinations within walking distance of your home, like shop fronts and restaurants, then you can cause your carbon footprint to fall off a cliff. It's not just density, but how we build the city. So if you want more people to use walking and biking in transit and to drive shorter distances, you have to expand the transportation menu. And lots of people say they want that. When we ask audiences if they have trips they'd rather make by walking or biking, they almost always say yes in big numbers. So it means rethinking how we do infrastructure. You probably remember the tragedy of the bridge collapse on 8th Street at Florida International University in the suburbs around Miami. That bridge was being built for pedestrians and bikes to get across a big, violent, loud, scary road, 8th Street. So why is 8th Street so big in the first place and so hard to cross? Let's take a look at it diagrammatically. It's because there are destinations toward the east, in the foreground on this picture, and there are lots of homes on the west, in the background of this picture. And people have to get from one to the other. And so they thought, well, everybody's going to drive every time, for everything, every day. So we're going to need more and more lanes. And so, of course, the result is they built this road to try and make it faster for people. What they did is inadvertently cause a lot more people to go farther in the same amount of time. And so now there are a lot of people going back and forth on this corridor, and they thought, we're just going to have to build a bridge across it. But I ask you, what if they had used this land, instead of leaving it as a highway and giving up on it, what if they had used this land to install transit, maybe on rubber tires, maybe on rails, so that people had an option to get back and forth on transit instead of making that drive? And what if we also made it possible to walk and bike by planting shade trees and building bike paths and walkways? The same infrastructure project in the same right-of-way could have done much more good and wouldn't have been maxed out with just a few more cars. And we could have been able to cross it on foot like any normal city street instead of having to build a bridge across it. Now, I'm talking a lot about walkable streets, so let's look at what they are. I wrote a big fat book on street design with my buddy John Massengale, and we titled that The Secret to Great Cities and Towns. And as strange as it might sound, I think good street designs are a key to affordable housing, or at least an affordable lifestyle, even in places where housing prices are going up. I'll explain why. First of all, it might technically be possible to walk. This street, for example, has sidewalks along the edges, but if you're not likely to do so if it looks like this. So we have to make streets where people actually want to be. So a lot of the work in street design is now going back to the streets we've inherited and recreating them, adding the missing street trees, adding the missing infrastructure for walking and biking. One nice example of seeing that priority and rebalancing is on the main street in downtown West Palm Beach. This is CLEMATIS Street. And CLEMATIS Street was, over the years, widened, made one way. It was turned into a bigger and bigger highway with smaller and smaller sidewalks during the decline of the downtown. And now they've completely remade it. It's a narrow two-lane, two-way street with broad sidewalks, actually curbless and slow and safe. And people love it so much. They come out in big numbers just to be there. And there's outdoor dining, and the street is from time to time closed for special events. It no longer feels like just a car place where pedestrians are grudgingly tolerated. It feels like a pedestrian place that cars are allowed to visit. So here's CLEMATIS Street in its interim stage, where it was a little narrower and had a couple of trees, but still too hot and the sidewalks too narrow. So CLEMATIS Street was rebuilt. Just getting the lanes the right size made all the difference. Now there's room for more trees, more outdoor dining, and more walking. And someday this will be used by other kinds of transportation technology we probably can't even imagine right now. But it's set up as a place where pedestrians want to be, and that's the bottom line. Now I want to show you a little bit about the magic bollards on Clematis Street, because I think this is pretty cool. They're just those simple stainless steel pins, but for a small upgrade of cost, you can make them recessible. So the retractable bollards go down in the ground or they get pulled back up, and you can take a space that a few minutes ago was a parking space and repurpose it as an outdoor dining space. Now the best thing, of course, of all, to lower the cost of transportation and make more funds available for housing would be for people to be able to go back to having perhaps a family car or no car instead of the personal car, one per every person over age 16. What I'm talking about is a car optional neighborhood, kind of like a clothing optional beach is a place where you don't have to wear a bathing suit. A car optional neighborhood is a neighborhood where you don't have to wear 4,000 pounds of steel and fiberglass around you just to go from one place to another. And this is incredibly important. This is the new executive parking lot at our office. So many of us arrive at our office on 2 wheels instead of 4, and we get the best parking spaces on the block. But we realized that a car optional neighborhood was what our employees were asking for. It's probably what your employees are asking for as well. So I have a little recipe, 10 different parts to this recipe for growing a car optional neighborhood. And I'll just describe to you what some of those things are. To explain them, I'm going to use a new plan for yet another neighborhood in Chattanooga. This is the Bend along the Tennessee River, former industrial place that's now about to become Chattanooga's first true 21st century car optional neighborhood. Principle number 1, bring things closer together. Assembling a practical blend of mixed uses in an in-town location. That'll reduce a lot of car trips to their shortest possible length, and it'll take other car trips and eliminate them altogether by facilitating walking, biking, and transit. So part of this is just achieving the minimum livable density that makes transit work and allows people to afford the houses, those attached houses I talked about, or this sort of example. You got to do that. Can't push everything farther apart. You got to bring things closer together. And there's plenty of room to do that on these recycled sites in Chattanooga. There are some existing buildings, but outside those buildings, there are vast acreages of parking lot like you see here. So we're going to peel back some of the asphalt, lay a new pattern down on the land, insert streets and parks, and build the development program around that. So here's an idea number 2, which is to design slow, highly walkable, safe, and bikeable streets. So if you're, for example, going to your place of work, if you wanted to choose to go there by bike, if there was a safe and comfortable, usually separated place for you to ride, you'd be more likely to do that than to drive. Principle number 3 is for the blocks to be small and in an interconnected pattern. And you can see that when you get up above the plan and look down over the rooftops in the Bend in Chattanooga. And that's actually because the historical street system of the surrounding downtown streets and its adjoining Southside neighborhood are extended into and reconciled in the grid pattern in the neighborhood's street layout. Principle number 4 is to require street-oriented architecture and big, green, comfortable spaces. When you put those two together, it's a magical address-making combination. Here, for example, mixed-use buildings, including places to live, adjacent to a big, generous green central park or Park Avenue. Just take the camera above the treetops and look back. You can see, well, these would be good addresses for your corporation or for your house, but also great places to walk along the sidewalk. And that means designing the buildings differently. You know, actually having buildings with doors and windows and balconies and storefronts facing the street instead of the blank walls or garages that we seem to see in places where they don't care about that. Principle number 5 is the most important one of all. Plant street trees and then plant some more. You need lots of street trees, and especially in the temperate climates and subtropical climates to support walking. And that's that principle, and the ones like it are on display in the plan for the Bend. Now, principle 7 is about technology. It says we know all kinds of new transportation technology are coming out. We are going to have electric vehicles. We're going to have autonomous and connected vehicles at some point. We have bike share, and we have scooter share, and we have ultralight small vehicles, and whatever comes next. So we like to think about that menu and design the neighborhood so that it is ready to accommodate them. Circulators and trolleys, for example. The scooters that are incredibly popular. Electric vehicles that are part of a fleet that belongs to the building, not just to rideshare services. What about all those apps that tell you just in time when the bus is coming and where the parking is available? And what about autonomous vehicles? At some point, we'll see autonomous shuttles take people from the Bend back and forth to their workplaces or to the music venue or to the South Side or downtown. And what about deliveries? Freight. Well, freight is now coming to us in smaller and smaller vehicles as the online retailers seek to shorten the amount of time to perhaps as little as 30 minutes in the near future. And I like this one. It's basically a glorified bike, kind of an electric tuk-tuk that is so small you can never lack the ability to find a parking space. So, and part of the idea of the Bend is just to recycle this great piece of real estate into a new address that people would love being in. But that also meant being stingy with the land that was there so that we didn't waste it on anything. And the waste that comes with parking is really dramatic. This is Atlanta as seen from my hotel room window. And all that pink stuff is parking. Actually, I got in a little trouble when I showed this slide in Atlanta. Someone jumped up from the audience and said, "No, Victor, that building in the middle, that's also parking." So turns out I didn't realize it. But there's so much of the land resource absorbed into the parking, and all that cost for the land and the parking structures is being passed on to the users of the dwellings. Imagine with all those new car technologies, with Uber and Lyft replacing the need for so many parking spaces at hotels, for example, and on, how car ownership can decrease and parking won't be so necessary. Some prognosticators predict that with autonomous and connected vehicles, the demand for urban parking spaces will drop by as much as 85%. And that's going to make a lot of room available for affordable housing and more green space and other public purposes. The principle is let's right-size the parking. And why? Because it's expensive. It's really expensive. A surface parking lot is expensive enough. When you have to put it in a structure or put it underground, it's astronomically expensive. I put that cost on the unit. Just why? Because it's needed or because the zoning says so? So when you get above the Bend and look down at the model, you see that we have plenty of parking. It's just very discreet and it's in relatively small supply in the middle of the blocks and along the street. Parking spaces is not overdone. Principle 9 is to plan for showers in the workplaces so that people can ride their bike to work without worrying about getting sweaty. And the last one is all about the mobility hub. It says we should plan these neighborhoods around transit access to the rest of the region. And so you can imagine concentrations of civic and workplace and housing that are around a mobility hub where you can easily switch between, say, the express bus and the scooter share or the bike share bike or your own bike or walking or a neighborhood circulator to make that last half mile to and from the transit center. Now last, what can you do? If you're an employer, you should get in the housing game, especially if you're in healthcare or running a university or any other kind of big concentrated employment. And there's lots of opportunity for doing that in ways that can make elegant neighborhoods people really love. For example, in this image, you see an apartment building in the center, and then around it, small cottages. They don't have to have big yards of their own, and row houses in and among the single family neighbors. And that simple technique, finding those small pieces of acreage and blending the housing types, will help a lot. If you're an employer, like the employer who owns this assisted living center, you should be trying to figure out a way to put housing for caregivers right on the same block. And so here you see cottages and houses for independent living, people who are still moving on their own, and for people who work in the larger building taking care of those who are now in nursing care or assisted living. If you want to recruit and retain the best healthcare workers, you need some housing for them that's right where they work, so they can have a high quality of life even though their wages haven't kept pace. And what if you're a developer? I have a couple of pieces of advice here. You're probably tired of being the bad guy or bad gal all the time, and you're wondering what you can do. The first thing is design better. Put those buildings with the streets that make good streets. Put them with their doors and windows facing the street, not the blank walls. Bring designers into the planning process at the beginning, not after all the big decisions have already been made by the lawyers or somebody. Now, do the math, and that will tell you that it's better to make a lot of small bets instead of making one gigantic one with big wads of money and big acreages, and then do it again and do it again. And if you get good at it, show others how to do it. Now, you might become a developer like Bernice Radel, who I mentioned before, who does things like these beautiful renovations, and she does whatever it takes for her tenants to give them the best quality of life, even though they're not paying the highest price. And she does it artfully. Look at this building. She turned from a sow's ear into a silk purse. And that's Bernice in the background working on the community garden. We need a lot more Bernice Radels who will devote themselves to Pensacola. Now, if you're an elected official, there are some very special and important things you can do. The most important power you have is the power to make the rules. You remember when I talked before about Arlington County in Virginia? They did the Columbia Pike Plan, and they adopted a special code so that it became possible to redevelop the underutilized sites along Columbia Pike. And a lot of housing was produced. But it became expensive because it went from having been forgotten about to being highly desirable. And so they went back and they used the rulemaking procedure for a much larger area along the corridor. First, they did a lot of envisioning to decide what they wanted it to be like when it was finished. And then they documented that and built it into the maps and into the rule books with very specific instructions for the developers to take uncertainty out of the puzzle. And that was an aid, of course, to investors who, instead of guessing about they might be able to get approved, could just look at the code and know immediately what they could or couldn't build on that property. So the power of making regulations is the most important one, in addition to the power of the purse. Now, what if you're running a public agency, public works department, or you're a planning department? Well, first of all, yes, make plans. You will be criticized for making plans because people say, oh, the plans sit on the shelf, they collect dust. Or you made pretty pictures, but it didn't happen. You have to make a plan in order to get anything good to happen. And you have to put that into documents that are compelling to investors, including public investors and foundations that might precede the for-profit developers. And if you're in the infrastructure business, it's all about what you build. Instead of thinking just wider and faster roads or better roads, what about building transit infrastructure and modifying your streets to make them more complete? That's the kind of help you can give as an agency. As citizens, you can participate. You can go to the planning hearings. You can go to the public workshops. You can volunteer your time to help build a plan and then stand in support of it so that you can communicate to your elected officials what you are for, not just what you are against. That means you have to come to your planning meetings with a problem-solving mindset. Hopefully you're helping the designers and consultants and the agency staff get that plan done so that they can build from the plan. Now these days might occur online instead of in a face-to-face meeting. Great. If it's a digital or a virtual charrette, show up on camera and put in your own ideas. It will pay huge dividends to you to participate as a citizen. So I'll leave you with this thought. If you want to know more about how to be a ready citizen planner, one thing you can do is go to our YouTube channel and watch this little series I've been working on called Town Planning Stuff Everyone Needs to Know. Get schooled up on walkable streets and mixed land uses and how design matters. And connect the dots.
Welcome back. Thank you, everyone. We're going to do the live Q&A right now. Thank you very much, Victor. That was fantastic. Huge interest in this topic in our community. We received more than 70 questions from people, and I know we cannot get to those in today, but maybe we can convince you to come back and we can answer a few more. So what I've done is the questions fell into some certain, the same buckets. So we're looking at income, at the different types, how to address the not in my backyard, how we can do this in rural communities, and then, how can a community like Pensacola do this? So many of the questions were very similar to each other, so I have combined them as much as I could so we can get started, because we've just got about 30 minutes here. So I will jump right in. I think to frame the discussion, let's talk income right now. So when you're talking about affordable housing and the price of the home, actually, are we talking $100,000, $500,000? What does it look like traditionally?
Well, the affordability is defined by what people can afford to pay based on wages. And so when you basically, when you talk about affordable housing, you're usually talking about housing for those who earn between 60 and 120% of the median income. There's also low-income housing and very low-income housing, which is an important topic, and housing for the homeless, also an important topic. But usually in the conversation about affordability, we're talking about that group that's in the 60 to 80 or 80 to 120% of median income. And since you have some very wealthy people in Escambia County and living on Florida's precious coastline, that pushes the median number up, as you know. And so what this basically means is that you have to realize it's not okay for the people who can't afford the best coastal view of the setting sun, or big view across open space, or have a grand address. It's important to have people in the neighborhood who may not have those views or have those most prestigious addresses, but they still perform all kinds of crucial functions, like classroom teachers, firefighters, police officers, healthcare workers, getting a lot of attention now at long last. And so, you really haven't got a community if all you've got is the wealthy people living alone in a kind of rich monoculture. So affordability, the number will vary depending on where you are. And so the census is a tool for that. We look at census tracts. But there is plenty of room to improve when it comes to affordability.
Is there a different solution when you're looking at affordable housing for those that are living below that poverty line?
Well, yes. First of all, it's amazing, actually, to me, after all the time that has passed, our 100-year experiment with zoning, for example, in the United States, we still have a lot of local governments requiring a very high minimum parking requirement per unit, even though the lower income households don't have as many cars per person in the household. And the very low income dwellers don't have a car at all very often. So a lot of senior citizens are beyond the age of driving. So then, but yet a unit is a unit in the zoning. And that means we're piling car costs on top of housing costs. We're making the housing more expensive to deliver because we're using up the land for a lot of parking. So this is a great example of the difference. With the moderate incomes and households of modest means, it's perfectly appropriate to have less parking provided, for example. Fits in with the fact that you need to keep their transportation more affordable while trying to keep their housing more affordable. So you work on the menu of walking, biking, and transit, low cost to the individual user per trip.
Would it be appropriate to look at different types of housing? We had a lot of questions about using accessory dwelling units, but you talked about those in your presentation. But what are your thoughts on prefabricated homes, manufactured housing, things like that, micro homes even as viable options for affordable housing? Does that fit in with a city's affordable housing plan?
Absolutely. I love this question. First of all, the accessory dwelling thing is just one part of a big menu, right? But what it proves is the idea that you can have a really great life, a high quality of life, in a small amount of square footage. And since the the cost of construction is so high and the cost of land underneath that unit is so high, it really helps to be able to go back to providing some small but beautiful units. Remember I said it's affordable housing we need, not more cheap, mean-spirited housing. Well, the ADUs are kind of a proving ground for the idea that that small cottage on the outbuilding or what have you can be very beautiful and provide a great quality of life. A studio unit might be excellent for someone who's just coming back to the neighborhood they grew up in, but isn't yet earning enough to buy the house their parents once owned. So I see the ADUs as kind of a great testing ground, not the whole solution, but a great way to demonstrate how great it is to have small units, not just big ones. Now, let's remember, we do have some modest income households who have big families, so we don't need just tiny units, but adding small units to the mix is really helpful. So the micro cottages or tiny homes are another place where experimentation should be very welcome, particularly if they're lovable. Let's think about, when you say manufactured housing, that sounds like it might be cheap and flat and plastic looking, or just be a minor upgrade over the old 1970s trailer park trailer. It doesn't have to be that at all. In fact, some really beautiful houses are possible with factory assembly and delivery onto the site. If you can shorten the amount of time that it takes to construct the house from the moment when you lay out the foundation to the moment when you hand the keys to the new occupant, then you will lower the cost, because time is money. Plus, in a factory, they can work around the clock. They can work in all kinds of weather. They can set up frames and molds and patterns so that they can rapidly do things very, very accurately over and over. Harder to do out in the heat of the sun. And so what we need to do, though, is get the design of those manufactured units to be superb, so that people, when they see them, will go, this is great. Has it always been here? Did some careful craftsman, carpenter, build this lovingly, like they did all those houses we love in the historic district? If you get that response, the manufactured home that you want. I know Marianne Cusado is on your schedule for an upcoming talk with CivicCon, and she's the national expert in this. So I hope you really put your questions to her. How can we get the manufactured house to look great and, have the porch that's the right depth and have the right amount of detail, even though it has a small footprint? And that's really good. Last thing on tiny houses, we see a lot, if you watch the HGTV shows and that sort of thing and see the magazine articles, it's a fascination in the media, tiny houses. And a lot of them have wheels. And you ask yourself, why is this house on wheels? Aren't they, for the most part, going to park it and hook it up to water and sewer and cable and power and leave it right where it is? And the reason it's on wheels is because it gets regulated differently. Now, that's a zoning thing. And if your local government is requiring someone to keep wheels on a house that might be perfectly happy on a permanent foundation, just so that they can find a way around the rule that prevents smallness, or around the rule that prevents the subdivision into a small lot for it to sit on, then it's the rules that are wrong, not the wheels.
What about the ability to rehab structures already in place versus new development? What would be the incentive? Can these existing homes and apartments be included in affordable housing plans?
Well, they should be, actually. And Mayor Libby Schaaf in Oakland, California, is one of the great leaders on this. She said, we're not just going to work on production of additional units. We're going to work on the maintenance of units that are already affordable for one reason or another. We're going to try to make sure more of them remain in the affordable inventory. And that requires public investment. So, for example, if you have an old building in an area that's vulnerable to hurricanes, and it hasn't yet had the upgrades necessary to strap it properly to the ground and to strap its rafters and trusses properly so that it can withstand a storm. And if it has old leaky windows and inefficient appliances and a really outdated energy hogging air conditioner system, all those things are costly, not every day, not just when there's a storm. And chances are that unit is leasing for a lower price than it otherwise could command in that neighborhood, because it's been left neglected or under improved. At some point, someone who discovers that address is going to come in. They're going to put in the marble countertops. They're going to put in some new hurricane-resistant windows. They're going to strap it down properly. They're going to add expensive appliances, and they're going to up the rent. And what can you do about that? One of the things you can do about that is make public investment in units that will remain in an affordable housing trust. So if you own the land, if local government or the community, society, including nonprofits and foundations, if they own the land under the unit, they can affect the long-term affordability of that unit. That's what Mayor Schaaf is working on that. So we need to produce new units, but we also need to see what things we can do to take so-called market affordable, which really means outdated or under-improved, neglected units, to make more of them remain part of the permanently affordable supply. And then nobody had to move. It wasn't a process of displacement. But if I sense from the 70 questions and from the great interest in this session that people want affordable housing in their community a lot. And I keep talking about ways the market can help with that, like loosening up the development rules or lowering the per unit land cost, or methods to offset it, like reducing the cost of transportation so the composite number is lower. But in the end, if you really want affordable housing, taxpayers should be putting their money where their mouths are and saying, we're going to make an annual sustained investment in this because it's important to us. And those are some of the ways you can do it.
Have you seen a community as an example that has done a really good job with this that we could look to, not just the city providing that land, but perhaps partnering with a nonprofit or group, community-minded group that would help facilitate something like that?
I can name a number of them, and I think nobody's got this exactly figured out. Quint was right when he started this off by saying this is really, really hard. And so I think let's be clear from the beginning that nobody's got it completely solved. It's that everybody's working on it. Some are making some successes and some headway. We should be copying their successes. But I can name 3 examples just off the top of my head that are all different, one from another. And they'll go from the biggest to the smallest. If you go to Arlington, Virginia, which I mentioned in the lecture, you will see there that they multiplied tenfold their community's active, intentional investment in affordable housing. They did it after they did their plan because they wanted all of the good things in their best neighborhoods to be available to all their neighborhoods. They wanted to kind of there's an equity focus there. And they made the kind of sustained public investment I was talking about. And they worked on the rule book. So they built in incentives, and they made it not just one formula, but they gave a whole range of different ways that someone wanting to come in and take advantage of the new, yes, liberalized zoning that loosened the reins on development a little bit. Someone wanted to take advantage of that. Here's how what they were expected to do to offset that by helping expand and preserve the affordable inventory. And they gave a number of different ways it could be done. So low-income housing tax credits get a lot of attention. That's a very limited tool, and it requires the big projects. But that's one. But they also have the Community Land Trust, an ongoing, annually invested in affordable housing trust that allows for small projects to happen. And they change the rules so that people can use their land more efficiently. And the transportation focus that I described before. So that's the Arlington example. I think that's an example of a wealthy community inside the Beltway, and Washington buffered a little bit from recessions. And a community ethos that's about doing good and caring about everybody. So that's playing out there. And so they use their powers as local government, I will say, aggressively. We don't see a lot of that further south, and we need other strategies. Now I'll go over to Chattanooga, which I talked about a little bit in the lecture at the very beginning. You know why the South Side in Chattanooga started seeing development? Because their foundations invested. They have very devoted and capable community foundations, several of them, the Lyndhurst Foundation, the Benwood Foundation, and a couple of others. And Lyndhurst and Enterprise joined together to form a consortium that would work on the south side. And they absorbed, as philanthropists, a lot of the pre-development costs, the cost of planning, engineering, walking things through City Hall to obtain permits. I like to say they did it the hard way, because they kind of one lot, one permit, one waiver, one variance, one exception, one rezoning at a time, acquiring land, getting all that stuff out of the way, and then setting it up so that a private investor, like a small builder or developer, could come build the project. And by doing so, they reduced the per unit land costs, they took down the pre-development costs. The foundations were a pioneer that had a public purpose in their work that got the ball rolling. And in a community that's seen disinvestment, getting the ball rolling is truly crucial. So that's an example that wasn't exactly government, although government said yes to a lot of things when they were asked. It was mostly the foundation leadership. And you have philanthropy and foundation leadership in Escambia County that's very capable in as much the same ways. So, of course, I've seen that playing out as I read through your newspaper articles, Lisa. Now, the third one I'll mention is in, get this, Starkville, Mississippi. Yes, little Starkville, Mississippi, college town. Out of the way, it's not the state capital. It's not the center of the state's economy. It's not coastal. But one gentleman named Dan Camp fell in love with a neighborhood next to the old abandoned cotton mill called the Cotton District. And he made it his life's work to bring that neighborhood back to life. And also, he wanted to do development there as a means of supporting him and his household. So they started building one beautiful cottage, one beautiful row house, one beautiful so-called mansion apartment building, which has 6 or 8 units in it at a time. And very gradually, he built affordable housing, and lots of it in that neighborhood without a subsidy. Most of them rental units, not absolutely every last one, but a lot of them in rental units, a lot of them owned by him. He just built one beautiful thing after another, got the neighborhood's confidence back. And a lot of the construction was actually done by people he trained that were from the neighborhood to do the work. So their households were improved by the employment and all the skill building that came with that. Affordable housing without a subsidy in our lifetimes in the United States, in the South, in a place where regulation is scarce. And so it's the opposite of the Arlington heavy-handed approach, but beautiful. And now the Cotton District shows up 25 years later on Starkville's city website list of their beautiful historic neighborhoods, even though most of the construction there is pretty recent.
We had received several questions just about how to combat the NIMBY attitude. So can you talk to me a little bit about how you've seen communities change the stigma of the term affordable housing and
Sure.
help society understand that affordable housing is not specifically for the extremely low income population?
Well, it helps to step back and look at where NIMBY reactions come from, not in my backyard, where that comes from. I think it comes largely from doubt about change, fear about what would be different from the existing conditions. And, particularly where growth is involved, I think we as Americans have become conditioned to be suspicious of growth and change. We're kind of hardwired to be suspicious of it because we look around and the built evidence all around us suggests so many examples where growth or change made things worse rather than better. And if you start talking about encouraging more income diversity in a town, in a neighborhood, particularly one that's worried about concentrations of poverty becoming, a wicked brew of crime or household failure or what have you. They are concerned about the overconcentration of poverty, but it probably spills over into a fear of growth and change and affordability in general. So a couple of things that we can do about that. First is regain their confidence by designing well and building places that are lovable and provide a very high quality of life. So, for example, even if the houses are a little closer together, which they are in your historic neighborhoods, I have to keep pointing out, and have been for a couple hundred years. If we're going to build things closer together, we have to still respect the need for personal privacy. We still have to put a high priority on private outdoor open space, so that even if you have a little garden behind your narrow lot house on a row with lots of other houses that are close to it, you still have a certain amount of light getting into the lower levels of those rooms. And so how you design the building and how you lay it on its plot is everything for preserving privacy, for access to light and air and open space. And the confidence that you're going to do that when you show up and say, just arrive in town and say, hi, everybody, I'm a developer, I'm going to build now. And it's going to be affordable, that tends to make people fear that you're going to do everything but what I just said. So to regain their confidence, you have to build a little bit and let them see it and say, this is what I meant. And so local government can be really key in that, because enabling, pioneering early on demonstrations, let's say, of all of that at once: beautiful design, affordability, light and air and open space, not a concentration of poverty, and privacy. If you can do those things and show that the affordability didn't harm the tranquility of the neighborhood, it made it more beautiful, made it felt more complete, and actually provided some place for that young pharmacist that you grew up in your house but came back from college unable to form the neighborhood she grew up in. If you do that, you will regain their confidence and they'll say, hey, that's pretty good. Can we have some more of that? Another reason I love the ADUs, because people see them and they say, well, that's not so bad. Small doses make it a lot easier to accept this medicine of affordability. Now, if you want to design well, study the history, because the traditional building types of the historic neighborhoods with their charming front porches, even if they're small, or their narrow lots, those buildings have a kind of dignity and building to street relationship I spoke about a little bit in the lecture. You can replicate that if you just measure it and say, look how well it worked on this street, or on another street I love, this one in Georgian London, or this one in Old Town Alexandria, this one in Savannah, that one in New Orleans, and use those techniques that you can measure and study from the precedents in history, and then you'll regain their confidence. Where can you do it? I think one of the tools is to start in lost space, because it's the part of people's towns they love the least. So if you think about that old dead strip shopping center I spoke about, or the fading office park with its big parking lots, or even just the vacant lots in an area that was cleared for urban renewal but never built back, well, then growing there will feel like a positive change. The delta is in the plus direction, an upgrade over what existed before, so you can regain your confidence. Last thing I would do to overcome NIMBYism is, and this is why I use the example of Bernice Radel in Buffalo, but there are lots of others. John Anderson in Atlanta, and Bruce Tolar in Ocean Springs, and all sorts of people working right in your region. If you had 1,000 small builders and developers who actually lived in the neighborhood and cared about it, and that showed in the work that they were doing, people will be a lot less suspicious of that industry.
All right, we've got just a couple minutes left, so I need to move on to the hows of this. Hopefully we can get a couple questions in here, but what do you tend to see are the regulatory barriers that prevent affordable housing from getting built? What that we should have our eye on now as a community to get ahead of?
There's a long list: parking, lot coverage, setbacks, open space requirements, are at the top of the list. Prohibitions on mixed use, absurdly low height limits. Not the saying that you have to zone for skyscrapers, because you don't, but you could allow for floor heights, or for total building height that allows for a second or third floor with a generous ceiling, and the kind of graciousness of the historic buildings. I find a lot of communities adopt a height limitation that makes it impossible to actually build just even a well-proportioned looking building, much less one that had an extra floor to tuck an ADU underneath, or to allow for it to operate as a duplex. So I think the parking is the biggest one. That's the hardest one to overcome, because as Americans, we're kind of, our fingers are welded to our car keys, and we just like our other hand is now welded to our smartphones, and we are very hesitant when we hear somebody talking about reducing the minimum parking requirements. But I think that's one of the things you can work on. Artificially created regulatory barriers include artificially low maximum densities. Back Bay in Boston, unbelievably beautiful and desirable neighborhood, that for 140 years has been, a model of great community design, would be impossible under the density maximums in most of our communities. And yet it's not skyscrapers, it's livable, beautiful urbanism. So those come to mind. I think the regulatory barriers can include making it difficult for people to combine live and work in the same building. So for example, if you have someone who needs an expanded home-based business, so that they can grow it a little bigger than it would be, say, in their spare bedroom, it might actually be possible to have a live-work unit somewhere so they can pay one rent or one mortgage instead of two, and expand employment in the area, take their car off the road at peak hour. There's so many public benefits, and yet we see rule after rule, fire department, health department, zoning, that conspire against live-work combinations. So there's another one that's worth tackling.
All right, so we just have 2 minutes left here. So one last question for you that you need to wrap up in that amount of time. Aside from the pandemic, what will be the single greatest issue to face American cities in the next 5 years?
I love that you said aside from the pandemic, as if any of us can think about anything else at this time in our history. Well, the truth is the pandemic makes plain what I would have answered to that question anyway, which is the biggest challenge facing us is disparity and inequity. We have reached a point in America, and I made a glancing blow reference to this when I spoke about the employer and the wages early on, but we have a shrinking middle class. And that means, and that shrinking middle class has less and less access to things that it would have traditionally looked for, like that missing middle housing that I spoke about before. So I think there was a time in American history when we were the planning was mostly focused, let's say, on protecting public health from the toxic, poisonous industrial city. 120 years ago, that was the origins of the modern city planning profession. And then through a lot of the 20th century, it seemed that the priority for planning was how to convert our old walkable, transit-served cities to driving cities. The transportation dominated every other concern, and so we made a lot of mistakes in planning during that era. But that was everybody's focus: is how do I make wider and better and bigger, faster roads? I think we're past that stage now for a lot of reasons I laid out in the lecture. Well, what stage are we in? We're in the one where the priority for planning is to address this disparity and to help grow that middle class, and embrace the idea of equity, not just as a goal or some kind of aspirational thing, but something that either is or isn't. So I think in the next 5 years, in the next 25 years, we're going to be in the equity-seeking era for city planning. And the way we do that, well, it isn't just government, doing stuff. It's also letting the market naturally do things it would do if you allowed it. So if you were going to be more generous and you want employers to have more money to spend on the wages so the households can bring in more income and afford more in housing, transportation, and everything else, that money is going to come from success, not just from spending. Where's the money come from to pay for the stuff you want, including affordable housing? It comes from creating value, those places where people want to be, and from controlling unnecessary costs. That's how we're going to do it.
Which is what CivicCon is all about. You summed that last sentence up perfectly for us. Well, they are about to cut us off. So I need to say thank you so much. We hope to be able to get you to answer some more of these questions for us. Great. So pick up your phone. And this video, of course, if you want to see it in its entirety, if you missed part, it'll be on pnj.com by tomorrow. Everyone, a survey has already been sent to your email, so you can tell us what you think and what you want next. Have a fantastic evening, everybody. Please stay safe. We hope to see all of you in person very soon. All right, bye-bye.